They called him Jimmy the Gent because of how he carried himself. They should have called him Jimmy the Executioner for what he did to everyone who trusted him. New York City, 1931. James Burke was born into abandonment. His mother gave him up immediately, and he spent his childhood bouncing between foster homes and orphanages in a system that treated children like inventory. No family wanted him permanently. No one showed him love. He learned early that the world was brutal, that trust was dangerous, and that the only person you could rely on was yourself. The orphanages of Depression-era New York weren't nurturing environments. They were survival training. Bigger kids stole from smaller ones. Adults administered punishment casually. Food was scarce. Warmth was rare. Young Jimmy learned to fight, to steal, to lie, and most importantly, to never show weakness. Emotions were liabilities. Compassion was foolishness. The only thing that mattered was power. By his teenage years, Jimmy was running wild through Brooklyn, stealing cars, robbing stores, and building a reputation as someone who was both intelligent and completely ruthless. He wasn't just another street punk. He had organizational skills, strategic thinking, and the ability to plan complex crimes. But he also had a hair-trigger temper and a willingness to use violence that made even hardened criminals nervous. Jimmy's Irish heritage meant he could never be a made man in the Italian mafia, no matter how much money he earned or how many crimes he committed. This limitation defined his entire criminal career. He would always be an associate, always outside the inner circle, always expendable in ways that Italian members weren't. That exclusion bred resentment and paranoia that would eventually manifest in mass murder. But exclusion also gave Jimmy a twisted kind of freedom. He didn't have to follow certain mafia rules about how to operate or who to work with. He could be more creative, more brutal, and more independent than made men. Jimmy turned his outsider status into an advantage, becoming one of the most successful and feared criminals in New York despite never receiving formal membership in a crime family. In the 1950s, Jimmy Burke connected with Paul Vario's crew in the Lucchese crime family. Vario recognized Jimmy's talents immediately. He was a brilliant earner, capable of planning and executing complex robberies that generated enormous profits. Jimmy specialized in hijackings at Idlewild Airport, later JFK, stealing trucks loaded with merchandise worth hundreds of thousands. He was so successful that he earned the nickname Jimmy the Gent for his well-dressed, seemingly respectable appearance. The nickname was deeply ironic. Jimmy was many things, but gentle wasn't one of them. He was a sociopath who killed without remorse, a paranoid who saw betrayal everywhere, and a control freak who wanted absolute dominance over everyone around him. But he dressed well, spoke politely, and could be charming when it served his purposes. The gent persona was just another tool, a disguise that let him operate with less suspicion. Jimmy's relationship with the Lucchese family was complicated by his ethnicity. He generated millions for the family, kicked up percentages to Paul Vario, and followed most organizational rules. But he could never be more than an associate, never fully trusted, never given the protections that came with being made. This created a permanent tension. Jimmy was valuable but vulnerable, profitable but potentially expendable. He surrounded himself with a crew of criminals who specialized in hijacking and robbery. Henry Hill became one of his protégés, learning the trade under Jimmy's tutelage. Tommy DeSimone, another associate, was Jimmy's enforcer, a violent psychopath who killed on Jimmy's orders without hesitation. Jimmy built a team that was efficient, profitable, and absolutely loyal to him, at least initially. The hijacking operation was sophisticated. Jimmy had connections with airport workers who provided information about shipments, what was being loaded, when trucks would be leaving, which guards could be bribed. His crew would intercept trucks, take them to warehouses, and fence the merchandise through established buyers. The operation generated millions annually, and Jimmy's percentage made him wealthy. But Jimmy was never satisfied. More money, more power, more control. His ambitions were limitless, and his methods became increasingly brutal. People who crossed him disappeared. Witnesses who might testify died mysteriously. Jimmy was building a reputation as someone who solved problems through murder, and that reputation would eventually define his legacy more than his criminal success. Jimmy Burke didn't just tolerate violence. He embraced it as his primary management tool. If someone stole from him, they died. If someone talked too much, they died. If someone simply made Jimmy nervous, they died. Murder wasn't a last resort. It was standard operating procedure. And Jimmy didn't feel guilt or remorse about it. To him, killing was just business, no different from hijacking a truck or fencing stolen goods. Tommy DeSimone was Jimmy's primary killer, but Jimmy participated personally when he felt it necessary. He strangled victims, shot them, and orchestrated their disposal with the same calm efficiency he applied to planning robberies. Bodies were buried in remote locations, dissolved in chemicals, or simply dumped where they'd never be found. Jimmy treated murder like a technical problem requiring practical solutions. His paranoia intensified as his criminal success grew. Jimmy trusted no one completely, believing everyone was a potential informant or traitor. This paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. Law enforcement was constantly trying to flip his associates, and informants were destroying mob crews throughout New York. But Jimmy's response was disproportionate. Instead of being careful, he was murderous. Anyone who gave him the slightest reason for suspicion became a target. The crew that worked for Jimmy lived in constant fear. They knew that one mistake, one careless word, one perceived slight could result in death. Jimmy demanded absolute loyalty while offering none in return. He'd work with someone for years, then kill them without warning if he decided they were a risk. This created an atmosphere of terror that kept people in line but also guaranteed that eventually, someone would cooperate with law enforcement to escape. Jimmy's violence wasn't limited to criminal associates. He killed civilians who witnessed crimes, truck drivers who got in the way of hijackings, and anyone else who threatened his operations. To Jimmy, all human life outside his own had zero value. People were tools to be used and discarded. This sociopathic worldview made him extraordinarily dangerous and ultimately doomed him to either death or life imprisonment. In 1978, Jimmy Burke began planning what would become the largest cash robbery in U.S. history at the time, the Lufthansa heist. The opportunity came through Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo terminal employee with serious gambling debts owed to bookies connected to Jimmy's crew. Werner provided inside information about a massive cash shipment that would be stored at the terminal. Approximately $5 million in cash plus millions more in jewelry. Jimmy assembled a crew carefully. He needed men who were competent, trustworthy, relatively speaking, and willing to commit a major armed robbery. The team included career criminals, hijackers, and professional thieves who'd worked together before. Henry Hill helped recruit and coordinate. Tommy DeSimone would participate in the actual robbery. Martin Krugman, a bookmaker, had initially brought Werner to Jimmy's attention and expected a finder's fee. The planning was meticulous. Jimmy studied the cargo terminal's layout, learned the security procedures, identified weak points in their systems, and developed a detailed operational plan. The robbery would happen early in the morning when staffing was minimal. The crew would overwhelm security through speed and surprise rather than extended confrontation. They'd be in and out in under an hour. Jimmy understood that the planning phase was critical. One mistake, a detail overlooked, a security measure underestimated, a timing error, could result in arrests, shootouts, or complete failure. He rehearsed the operation mentally, considered contingencies, and prepared for potential problems. Jimmy's intelligence and organizational skills were never more evident than during the Lufthansa planning. He was a brilliant criminal strategist when focused. But Jimmy also made a fatal error in judgment. He assembled a large crew, 6 men directly involved in the robbery, plus several more who provided support. Each person represented a potential informant, a link in a chain that law enforcement could exploit. Jimmy believed he could control this risk through intimidation and loyalty. He was catastrophically wrong. At approximately 3 a.m. on December 11, 1978, 6 masked gunmen entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. They knew exactly where to go, which guards to neutralize, and where the cash was stored. The operation went almost perfectly. Security was overwhelmed quickly. The vault was opened using keys taken from guards, and approximately $6 million in cash and jewelry was loaded into a van within an hour. The robbery itself was textbook perfect. No shots were fired. No one was seriously injured. The crew escaped without immediate pursuit. They drove to a prearranged location, transferred the money into different vehicles, and dispersed. Within hours, they'd committed what was then the largest cash robbery in American history, and law enforcement had no immediate suspects. Jimmy Burke should have been celebrating. He'd just orchestrated the score of a lifetime, a heist that would generate millions in profit and cement his reputation as one of the greatest criminal minds in New York. The money was enough to set up everyone involved for life. It was the perfect crime, executed flawlessly. But perfection didn't last. Almost immediately, problems emerged. Some crew members started spending money recklessly, buying luxury cars and expensive items that attracted attention. Louis Werner, the inside man, was almost immediately identified as suspicious because investigators knew about his gambling debts and connection to the cargo terminal. The FBI launched an intensive investigation, and Jimmy realized that his perfect heist had created a massive problem. Too many people knew too much. Jimmy's paranoia, always present, exploded into full-blown terror. He had 6 men who'd participated directly in a robbery, several more who'd helped plan it or provided support, and all of them were potential informants. If even one person decided to cooperate with the FBI to avoid prison, the entire operation would unravel. Jimmy knew what he had to do. The crew that had made him millions would have to be eliminated, systematically and completely. Within weeks of the Lufthansa heist, Jimmy Burke began systematically murdering everyone connected to the robbery. His rationale was coldly logical. Dead men can't testify. If everyone who knew about the heist was eliminated, law enforcement would have no witnesses, no testimony, and no prosecutable case. The murders weren't crimes of passion. They were calculated executions designed to protect Jimmy from prosecution. Stax Edwards, a bartender who'd participated in the heist, was the first to die. He'd been tasked with disposing of the van used in a robbery but got high and forgot. The van was discovered by police, potentially containing forensic evidence. For this mistake, Stax was shot 6 times in his apartment on December 18, 1978, exactly 1 week after the heist. Tommy DeSimone pulled the trigger on Jimmy's orders. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who'd brought the Lufthansa opportunity to Jimmy and expected a finder's fee, started complaining about not receiving his share. He was last seen on January 6, 1979. His body was never found. Krugman had made the fatal mistake of pressuring Jimmy Burke for money. That pressure signed his death warrant. Tommy DeSimone, Jimmy's primary killer and the man who'd murdered Stax Edwards and others, disappeared on January 14, 1979. Tommy had become a liability. He was violent, unpredictable, and drew too much attention. He'd also murdered a made man in the Gambino family years earlier, and that family wanted revenge. Whether Jimmy directly ordered Tommy's death or simply allowed the Gambinos to take him is unclear, but the result was the same: another witness eliminated. Joe Buddha Manry and his girlfriend Fran were found shot to death on February 10, 1979. Louis Cafra and his wife Joanna disappeared in March 1979. Their bodies never recovered. Paolo Licastri was found murdered in May 1979. The death toll mounted systematically, each murder removing another potential witness, another link in the chain connecting Jimmy to the heist. Henry Hill watched this massacre with growing horror. He'd been part of Jimmy's crew for years, trusted Jimmy, and considered him a mentor. But now Henry realized the truth. Jimmy Burke wasn't protecting the crew, he was eliminating it. Everyone who knew about Lufthansa was being killed, and Henry understood with terrifying clarity that he was on that list. His survival now depended on staying useful enough to keep alive and vigilant enough to avoid being caught alone with Jimmy. The Lufthansa murders created a climate of absolute terror within Jimmy Burke's crew. Associates who'd worked with him for years suddenly realized they were expendable, that decades of loyalty meant nothing if Jimmy decided they were risks. The murders continued sporadically through the early 1980s, each one sending a message: "I know what you know, and I can reach you anytime." Jimmy's paranoia wasn't limited to Lufthansa participants. He started viewing everyone as potential informants. Old friends became suspects. Longtime associates became targets. Jimmy's world narrowed until the only person he truly trusted was himself, and even that trust was conditional. He lived in constant fear of arrest, constantly calculating who might flip, constantly planning preventive murders. This paranoia destroyed what remained of Jimmy's criminal organization. No one wanted to work with someone who might kill them for looking nervous. Recruitment became impossible. Who'd join a crew where the boss regularly murdered his own people? Jimmy's reputation as an earner was now overshadowed by his reputation as a killer. He was toxic, and everyone in the criminal underworld knew it. But the paranoia wasn't entirely irrational. Law enforcement was building cases against him, using wiretaps and surveillance. Witnesses who'd survived were being pressured to cooperate. The FBI knew Jimmy was responsible for the Lufthansa heist and the subsequent murders, but proving it required testimony from people who were either dead or terrified. Jimmy's murder spree had accomplished its goal, protecting him from immediate prosecution, but it had also isolated him completely. Paul Vario, Jimmy's boss in the Lucchese family, watched the situation deteriorate with concern. The heat from Lufthansa was affecting everyone in the crew. Federal investigations were disrupting operations, and Jimmy's murder spree was making the entire organization look unstable and dangerous. Vario couldn't control Jimmy, couldn't stop the killings, and couldn't distance himself enough to avoid contamination. The relationship that had made both men wealthy was now endangering both. While dealing with Lufthansa fallout, Jimmy Burke got involved in another scheme that would eventually contribute to his downfall. The Boston College point-shaving scandal of 1978 to 79. Henry Hill had connections with Boston College basketball players through a friend, and they developed a plan to fix games by having players intentionally underperform to control point spreads. The scheme was simple: bribe key players to ensure Boston College either won by less than the point spread or lost games outright. Jimmy and his associates would bet heavily on the outcomes, knowing the fix was in. It was essentially risk-free gambling. They knew the results before games were played. The potential profits were enormous, and the risk seemed minimal compared to armed robbery. But the point-shaving scheme had problems from the beginning. Some players cooperated inconsistently, either failing to underperform enough or getting cold feet and playing normally. Unexpected game circumstances made controlling outcomes difficult. And most dangerously, too many people knew about the fix. Players, gamblers, bookmakers, and various associates all had knowledge that could eventually reach law enforcement. Jimmy made significant money from the scheme when it worked, but the inconsistency frustrated him. He was used to controlling outcomes through planning and intimidation. Basketball games, influenced by countless unpredictable factors, couldn't be controlled the same way. And the players, college kids with limited criminal experience, were terrible conspirators. Nervous, talkative, and prone to making mistakes. When Henry Hill was arrested on drug charges in 1980 and decided to cooperate with the government, the Boston College scandal became part of his testimony. Henry provided details about how the fix worked, who was involved, and how much money Jimmy made. The scandal, which seemed like easy money at the time, became another piece of evidence connecting Jimmy to criminal enterprises and demonstrating his willingness to corrupt any institution for profit. In 1980, Jimmy Burke's world began collapsing. Henry Hill's arrest and subsequent cooperation provided law enforcement with a witness who knew everything. The hijackings, the murders, the Lufthansa heist, the Boston College fix. Henry couldn't testify about everything he knew, some of it was hearsay, and some murders lacked physical evidence. But he provided enough to build multiple cases against Jimmy. Jimmy was arrested on various charges throughout the early 1980s. The Boston College point-shaving scandal resulted in charges for conspiracy and sports bribery. Separate investigations targeted his involvement in hijackings and robbery. Law enforcement was building a web of cases, hoping that even if some failed, others would succeed in putting Jimmy away permanently. The Lufthansa case remained frustratingly difficult to prosecute. Most witnesses were dead, killed by Jimmy. The few survivors were terrified and uncooperative. Physical evidence was minimal. The getaway vehicles had been disposed of, the money had been laundered or hidden, and the planning had been done face-to-face without written records. Jimmy's murder spree had accomplished its primary goal, making prosecution for the heist nearly impossible. But Jimmy's paranoia and violence became his ultimate downfall. In 1982, he was charged with the murder of Richard Eaton, a drug dealer who owed Jimmy money. This murder was separate from Lufthansa but demonstrated Jimmy's pattern of killing people who crossed him. The evidence included testimony from witnesses who'd seen Jimmy with Eaton before his disappearance and forensic evidence connecting Jimmy to the crime scene. Jimmy's trial strategies involved attacking witness credibility, claiming evidence was planted or contaminated, and maintaining complete denial of involvement in any crimes. His lawyers portrayed him as a successful businessman wrongly targeted by corrupt law enforcement and lying informants seeking reduced sentences. But juries weren't convinced. The pattern of violence, the testimony from multiple sources, and the forensic evidence painted a clear picture of a career criminal who'd murdered his way through decades. In 1982, Jimmy Burke was convicted on federal racketeering charges related to the Boston College point-shaving scandal. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. While disappointing, prosecutors had hoped for longer. The conviction at least ensured Jimmy was off the streets and unable to order more murders. But it wasn't enough. Law enforcement wanted him convicted for the murders, particularly those connected to Lufthansa. In 1985, while already serving his federal sentence, Jimmy was convicted of the Richard Eaton murder. This time, the sentence was 20 years to life. The conviction was significant because it demonstrated Jimmy's pattern of violence and ensured he'd be in prison for decades at minimum. But prosecutors remained frustrated that they couldn't convict him for the Lufthansa murders or the systematic elimination of the heist crew. Prison didn't humble Jimmy Burke. He maintained his innocence, blamed lying informants and corrupt prosecutors, and portrayed himself as a victim of an unjust system. He showed no remorse for his crimes, no acknowledgement of the people he'd murdered, and no reflection on his life choices. To the end, Jimmy believed he'd done what was necessary to survive and prosper in a brutal world. His time in prison was spent primarily in isolation or protective custody. Jimmy was a high-profile inmate, and other prisoners knew his reputation. Some wanted to attack him for respect. Others wanted to avoid him entirely. Prison administration kept him separated from general population to prevent violence, both against Jimmy and by Jimmy against others. As years passed, Jimmy's health declined. Prison medical care was basic, and the stress of confinement accelerated his aging. The man who'd been physically imposing and intimidating in his prime became an elderly prisoner, weakened by time and incarceration. But his mind remained sharp, his paranoia intact, and his refusal to accept responsibility complete. One of the great mysteries surrounding Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa heist is simple. Where did the money go? Approximately $6 million in cash was stolen, plus millions more in jewelry. Jimmy allegedly received the largest share as the organizer. Yet when he was arrested, law enforcement couldn't find the money. No secret bank accounts, no hidden safe deposit boxes, no buried caches of cash. The Lufthansa money had simply vanished. Several theories exist. Some believe Jimmy laundered the money through legitimate businesses, converting it slowly into real estate and other assets that appeared legitimate. Others think he buried it in various locations, planning to retrieve it after release from prison. Some suggest he lost much of it through bad investments or gambling losses. And some believe he gave portions to the Lucchese family as tribute, reducing his take significantly. The most likely explanation is a combination. Jimmy kept some cash buried or hidden, laundered some through businesses, lost some to poor decisions, and shared some with the mob. But the exact amounts and locations remain unknown. Even Henry Hill, who testified extensively about Jimmy's operations, claimed not to know where the bulk of the Lufthansa money ended up. This mystery has fueled decades of speculation. Treasure hunters have literally searched for buried Lufthansa money, digging in locations associated with Jimmy Burke based on rumors and tips. None have found anything significant. The money may have been spent, lost, seized without being identified as Lufthansa proceeds, or still hidden somewhere waiting to be discovered. Jimmy refused to discuss the money's location with anyone, including law enforcement. When offered deals to reduce his sentence in exchange for returning stolen funds, he declined. Whether this was because he genuinely didn't have access to the money anymore or because he was protecting his one remaining asset for potential post-prison life is unknown. But his silence meant the Lufthansa fortune remained one of crime history's enduring mysteries. In 1990, Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas introduced Jimmy Burke to a new audience as Jimmy Conway, portrayed brilliantly by Robert De Niro. The film depicted Jimmy as charismatic, intelligent, and ultimately paranoid and murderous. De Niro's performance captured Jimmy's duality, the cultured exterior and the sociopathic interior, making Jimmy one of cinema's most memorable gangsters. Goodfellas took liberties with facts but captured essential truths about Jimmy Burke. The film showed his hijacking operations, his mentorship of Henry Hill, and most chillingly, the systematic murder of the Lufthansa crew. The scene where De Niro's character calmly smokes a cigarette while contemplating who needs to be killed next became iconic, a perfect encapsulation of Jimmy's approach to murder as mundane business. The film's success meant Jimmy Burke became a cultural figure, known to millions who'd never heard of the actual Lufthansa heist or the real criminal. Jimmy Conway became the template for the intelligent, controlled gangster who kills without emotion. De Niro's performance influenced how subsequent films and TV shows portrayed organized crime figures. But Goodfellas also romanticized Jimmy to some extent. The film emphasized his criminal brilliance and downplayed the casual cruelty. It made his murders seem almost justified, paranoid self-protection rather than sociopathic violence. The real Jimmy Burke was less charismatic and more purely evil than De Niro's portrayal. But cinema requires sympathetic elements even in villains. Jimmy, sitting in prison while Goodfellas became a cultural phenomenon, had complicated feelings about his cinematic representation. He was portrayed by one of history's greatest actors in one of cinema's greatest crime films. But that portrayal also reminded the world of his crimes, attracted new scrutiny to his case, and ensured his infamy would outlive him. The film made him immortal, but not in the way he might have hoped. As the 1990s progressed, Jimmy Burke's health deteriorated significantly. Prison medical records documented various ailments, heart disease, cancer, and complications from decades of stress and poor lifestyle choices. The man who'd once been physically imposing and feared was now elderly, sick, and confined to prison medical facilities. Jimmy was transferred to Wendy Correctional Facility in New York, where terminal prisoners received end-of-life care. He knew he was dying, and for perhaps the first time in his life, faced something he couldn't control or kill. Death was coming, and neither his intelligence nor his violence could stop it. On April 13, 1996, James Burke died at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York. He was 64 years old, having spent the last 14 years of his life in prison. The official cause of death was lung cancer, though his overall health had been failing for years. He died without ever being convicted of the Lufthansa heist or most of the murders he'd committed. In that sense, his murder spree had succeeded. He'd avoided accountability for his most significant crimes. The news of his death received moderate media attention. Goodfellas was still recent and beloved, so Jimmy's death was noted primarily through that connection. Obituaries describe him as the inspiration for Robert De Niro's character, the mastermind behind the Lufthansa heist, and a violent criminal who'd murdered numerous associates. But there was no mourning, no tributes, and no suggestion that the world had lost anything valuable. Jimmy's family held a small, private funeral. Few attended. Most of his crew was dead, murdered by Jimmy or killed by others. The associates who'd survived wanted nothing to do with his memory. The Lucchese family had moved on, dealing with their own prosecutions and problems. Jimmy Burke died as he'd lived, alone, trusted by no one, and trusting no one. Determining exactly how many people Jimmy Burke killed is impossible. He was directly convicted of only one murder, Richard Eaton, though law enforcement suspected him of being responsible for at least a dozen Lufthansa-related killings. But those were just the documented cases, the murders that left bodies and evidence. How many others did Jimmy kill over 4 decades of criminal activity? The Lufthansa killings alone numbered at least 9 confirmed victims. Stax Edwards, Martin Krugman, Tommy DeSimone, Joe Manry, Fran, Louis Caffra, Joanna Caffra, Paolo Licastri, and others whose disappearances were never officially connected. Each murder was calculated, designed to protect Jimmy from prosecution, and carried out with chilling efficiency. But those murders represented just one criminal operation. Jimmy had been actively criminal since the 1940s, working in an environment where violence was routine and murder was a standard problem-solving tool. How many hijacking witnesses did he kill? How many thieves who stole from him? How many potential informants? How many people simply unlucky enough to cross him? The real number could be dozens. The victims weren't just criminals. They were wives, girlfriends, family members of targets who might have overheard too much. Jimmy killed Joanna Caffera not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she was married to Louis. He killed Fran not because she participated in Lufthansa, but because she was dating Joe Manry. Collateral damage didn't exist in Jimmy's worldview, just necessary eliminations. Henry Hill estimated that Jimmy was responsible for 30 to 40 murders over his criminal career. While Henry's numbers were often unreliable, this estimate is probably not far from reality. Jimmy Burke was a serial killer who operated within organized crime, using its structures and protection to murder systematically for decades. The fact that he was only convicted of one murder demonstrates how successfully he avoided accountability. Jimmy Burke left behind a legacy of violence, paranoia, and ultimately, futility. He'd been extraordinarily successful as a criminal, earning millions, masterminding one of history's greatest heists, and avoiding conviction for most of his crimes. But success meant nothing when it ended in prison death at 64, with everyone who'd known him either dead or refusing to acknowledge his memory. For law enforcement, Jimmy represented a specific problem: the brilliant, violent criminal who understands the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses. He murdered witnesses, intimidated others, and left minimal evidence. The fact that he was only convicted of one murder despite committing dozens demonstrated the difficulty of prosecuting sophisticated organized crime figures who use violence to control information. For the Mafia, Jimmy was a cautionary tale about accepting non-Italians as associates. His inability to become a made man created resentments and paranoia that eventually manifested in mass murder. He proved that associates, lacking the protections and commitments of full membership, could be simultaneously valuable and dangerously unpredictable. His legacy contributed to increased caution about who was brought into criminal organizations. For popular culture, Jimmy Burke, or rather, Jimmy Conway from Goodfellas, became the archetype of the intelligent, paranoid gangster who kills everyone he knows. Robert De Niro's portrayal influenced countless subsequent depictions of organized crime figures. The image of the calm, controlled killer who treats murder as business became a trope repeated in films, TV shows, and books for decades. For the families of his victims, Jimmy's legacy was pure pain. Loved ones were murdered, bodies were never recovered, and justice was mostly denied. The fact that Jimmy died in prison provided some closure, but it couldn't undo the suffering he'd caused or bring back the dead. His death closed a chapter of violence but didn't heal the wounds. The ultimate irony is that Jimmy's greatest crime, the Lufthansa heist, destroyed him. If he'd simply accepted the heat, distributed the money fairly, and avoided murdering the crew, he might have gotten away with it. Law enforcement had limited evidence, witnesses weren't cooperating, and the case might have gone cold. But Jimmy's paranoia and violence turned a successful heist into a massacre that eventually contributed to his prosecution and imprisonment. His inability to trust anyone, including his own crew, transformed triumph into tragedy. Jimmy Burke orchestrated the biggest cash heist in American history, earned millions over 4 decades of crime, and ruled through intelligence and absolute terror. But he couldn't stop killing. Every witness eliminated, every potential informant murdered, every associate who made him nervous, dead. He murdered his way to safety and murdered his way to prison. The gent who dressed well and spoke politely left behind at least 30 bodies, destroyed countless families, and died alone in a prison hospital at 64, never convicted of his greatest crime but sentenced to life anyway. He proved that you can be brilliant, successful, and completely ruthless, and still end up in a cage dying of cancer, mourned by no one and remembered only as the psychopath who killed everyone he knew.